When they came out of the simulation room, Professor Jane was waiting for them and said congratulations on clearing, Group 7. She then went on to comment on their battle and said that it was commendable that they were able to turn their strategy, which was good in theory, into a realistic plan after the experience they had gained in their previous attempts. Dick once again congratulated Simon for his excellent work. But the professor also pointed out some shortcomings. She pointed out that there was a strong tendency to rely on the ability of one summoner, and the length of fighting time was too long, but overall, she had favorable comments. She also advised them to raise the mastery of Dark Flare and Curses as much as possible during the rest of the time and the weekend, as spell boosting through spell duplication was a good solution, but they had enough mistakes and needed to practice and make their dark magic stronger. Cammy was enthusiastic about improving her skills so that she could show better results next time. That was the end of all the advice and comments from the professor, and the whole team happily thanked her. When they left the training room, some students applauded them, but there were also many who looked at them with envy. It took them a long time, but they finally managed to defeat Cyclops. Cindy praised Simon, then came over and raised her hand. As Simon also spread his fingers with a smiling face, she high-fived him loudly. Simon asked Cindy how her group had dealt with the Cyclops. She told him how she turned into a ghostly state that was immune to any physical attacks, dodged the Cyclops attacks, and then returned and repeatedly slashed with the jet black side that her teammates had made. While everyone was exchanging stories in a friendly atmosphere, only Hector, who was taking a break after finishing the simulation, had a turbulent glow light up in his eyes and gritted his teeth in anger. After all the teams had used up all their attempts, they were all let go. It was their last class for the day and tomorrow was finally the weekend. Malin said that during the simulation everyone realized their weaknesses, but when she heard how other students were planning to spend their weekend at Rochest, and it annoyed her. She wanted their team to practice on the weekend, not rest. Dick asked her what the real reason for her irritation was. And then he immediately answered his question that Malin was so angry because Cammy was asked out on a date and her the ace of the ivory tower was not. This did not sit well with Malin at all. Cammy told her what it was like, but she turned down the offer. Cammy continued by saying that she wanted to practice with Simon because she realized that she had failed during the simulation. After answering like that, Cammy moved her eyes and looked at Simon's face. But our hero was a real dumbass in these matters and skillfully pretended not to notice the girl's sympathy. Then, when she met Simon's eyes, she was startled and quickly looked down. Dick said he'd have to pass, he had his own business schedule. Malin glared at him, but she didn't say anything more than that. For Dick, who aimed to become a merchant, the weekend schedule was as important as a class. Malin stared at Simon with a murderous expression and asked him what excuses he would have. He felt a pang of conscience with Malin's question. He would have a busy day tomorrow and personal training to make up for the lack of preparatory courses, so he would have to decline. He tried to explain it to her gently. There are only a few days left until the actual battle. Simon was going to train really hard with Pier this weekend. Actually, he didn't tell the other members of the group, but Simon's goal this time wasn't at the level of buying time with the undead. Simon was planning something that none of the summoning aspirants of Class A could even dare to do. Simon headed to the ruins to train with Pier. He was a little afraid to go back to the Forbidden Forest, but Pier was kind enough to pick him up in the forest. As Simon rode on Pier's back, they reached the ruins in minutes. As Simon entered, the conscripted skeletons approached him like puppies greeting their owner. Simon greeted them, smiled and patted their heads. Before that, Simon had bought a lot of different weapons for his skeletons, and when he opened his subspace, Pier wondered if he really came to train or if he decided to move here to live and brought all his stuff. When Pier was repairing the skeletons, he was surprised by their poor condition after the battle with Cyclops in the simulation. The skeletons that were injured during the simulation needed time to recover, so Pier suggested using a human-type skeleton. It is quite difficult for a beginner to control such a skeleton, so he had to be careful. Pier wanted to teach Simon how to control several skeletons at the same time, so before the training session, he asked him how many he could control at the moment. Simon replied that he could not control more than 2 at the same time. If he tried to control more than 3 units simultaneously, the thoughts in his head got entangled, and the command system fell into disarray. Most of all, he couldn't bear it as his mental strength rapidly went down, and a bad headache occurred. Hearing his response, Pier reassured him that it doesn't matter how many you can control at once, it's how well you do it, even if it's 1 or 2 skeletons. Pier suggested that they conduct a practice battle using no more than 2 skeletons. Simon agreed. And now there were 2 skeletons on each side, ready to fight. The battle began, and Pier told Simon to attack first. Simon sent his skeletons to attack, and immediately 2 skeletons with swords jumped off the floor. Pier also made his 2 sword-wielding skeletons charge in. A continuous clash, the harsh sound of iron hitting iron resounded as the swords collided. As Simon was contemplating on what move to make next, when Pier's 2 skeletons with spears attack and thrust their weapons from behind. Simon's skeletons withdrew and tried to dodge, but it was not enough, and the spear scratched the face of one of the skeletons. Then, Pier's skeletons with swords in front pushed back the skeletons who lost their balance. Simon's skeletons took the sword strikes in a precarious position with their backs bent. Then, as if they were waiting, the skeletons with spears returned and hit the legs with their spears, and Simon's skeletons fell to the floor, suppressed. In a moment, Simon's skeletons were already on the floor. He had lost. He accused Pier of not playing fair. They had agreed to use no more than 2 skeletons at a time, and he used 4. But Pier replied with a playful smile that he had only used 2 at a time, just like Simon. Simon began to understand. He did, in fact. Pier first moved the skeletons with the swords, then the skeletons with the spears. He then returned to the skeletons with the swords again, crossed to the spears, and repeated the movement. Pier saw that Simon was thinking and said that he seemed to have figured it out himself. It's not much of a big deal. It's called cross-operation. It's to expand the scope of limited control by quickly moving the control of the skeletons. Pier said that if he can't connect to multiple skeletons simultaneously, the key is to operate 2 at a time and make all the skeletons move. That was the strategy. Simon took a moment to understand Pier's words and think it through. 2 skeletons with spears came forward among Simon's skeletons and raised their hands in front of them. He made the skeletons with swords spread their palms. Then, he went to the skeletons with the spears and high-fived the spread palms. And now it seems that these skeletons were the best of friends. Simon asked if he had done everything right. And Pier was just delighted. He replied that it was a pleasure to train Simon, and it was really evident in his satisfied face. They continued their training. Their goal was to master cross-operation. After training with Pier, Simon returned to Kizen, where he continued to train with his friends as well. Each of them gradually improved their fighting skills, and Dick was very tired after the training, but Malin encouraged him that it was thanks to such training that they were getting stronger. Malin and Cammy took notice of Simon. His skeleton control skills have improved significantly. He used to be able to control only 2 skeletons at a time, but now he can control 3. They were amazed at how he had improved his skills in such a short time. As their interest in Simon's tutor suddenly rose, Simon smiled awkwardly. Simon said it was all thanks to the private lessons. They were just beaming with curiosity and admiration and asked him who was coaching him. Maybe it was some first-class necromancer, or someone from Kizen. Simon began to frantically justify that his father had introduced him to him. The girls really wanted to learn from him, because he was able to help Simon so much in one day, which meant that he was a great master of dark magic. Pier's clone hanging on Simon's school uniform as a decoration grinned as if he enjoyed the situation. He felt popular among Simon's friends and didn't hesitate to remind him of that, and Simon mentally asked him to be quiet because he had a headache. But he did not want to be silent and asked him to tell them that he would be happy to give them a lesson, but on the condition that they die and become part of their battalion. This was forbidden in Kizen, as Simon reminded him. Simon forced himself to put a smile on his face and opened his mouth. He apologized and said that this is a person who is really reluctant to reveal his identity. And he's really busy too. A disappointed Malin told him that he was just being greedy and didn't want to share because she wanted to take a couple of lessons from Simon's teacher too. Malin made a sullen face. Dick giggled while leaning back into his hands behind his head. He said that Simon had every right not to name his teacher, because the competition in Kizen was very high, and if anyone was better at summoning creatures than him, he would have to leave because of their stupid agreement. Jumping to her feet, Malin shouted that she would outperform Simon even without private lessons and added that they should all get up and continue training. The weekend had passed, and a new week came with the scheduled Cyclops performance evaluation. At the same time, there was one big change in Kizen's school life from this week on. That the student protection period had completely ended. The professors could officially evaluate and grade the students now, and they could also punish or take disciplinary action. The professors of Kizen revealed their true colors as if they had been waiting for it. Their attitudes had completely flipped, to the point that it almost made the students doubt if they were the same professors who treated them with kindness. Classes became harder, and students who couldn't keep up with the classes were mercilessly deducted. Students who were judged to be underperforming were also expelled from class. The students were weeping at the changed attitude of the professors, but only now could they feel the reality that they were in Kizen where weaklings were not needed. As proof of that statement, 19 people packed their things after the student protection period was lifted for 2 days. Despite the midterm exam, performance assessment, and dual assessment not yet being conducted, the dropout rate was this high. Simon also had a hard time adjusting to the changed atmosphere during the 2 days when the student protection period was lifted. Professor Bahil was especially unbearable, looking at students' homework and calling it garbage. And the students with the worst ones were immediately expelled from Kizen, saying that they were not worthy of being students and he did not want to see them again. And already 20 students were expelled on the first day. The students resented the little things that some professors took off their points for and how their classes changed after the defense period was over. If there was a professor who treated students the same as before, it was Hongpeng. To speak the truth, she didn't really care about the student protection period at all, as she made the students hang on a running hippo and climb a hill with a curse on since the beginning of the class. She even recklessly bumped them into a herd of hippos. So, unlike other professors' classes, where their difficulty jumped, Hongpeng's classes were the same. The students came to a point where they felt relatively comfortable with the combat magic class. Of course, Hongpeng wasn't really a professor who nitpicked students and gave them deductions or put pressure on them mentally either. Dick, who was running next to Simon while breathing heavily, said that still, it's way better to run thoughtlessly like this. Simon and Dick turned their heads. And they were surprised to see Malin, who usually was always behind in every running session, was catching up with the two today. Simon asked her what had gotten into her and when she had learned to run like that, and advised her not to overdo it. Instead of answering, Malin bit her lip and ran past the two of them at the end. Dick's eyes shook. He breathing heavily said how desperate she is to run like this, and by the way, what's wrong with her even if tomorrow is the Cyclops performance evaluation. Simon remembered his conversation with Cammy, who had told him something about Malin. Cammy had asked him then if he had practiced physical exercises with Malin. And then added that when she was practicing the curses of exhaustion, Malin had been practicing physically all day. As she said that she has no problem being able to apply the flash of darkness, but she can't rely only on the words of her friends to dodge Cyclops blows. As the leader of Group 7 and a member, she felt more responsibility to evaluate Cyclops' performance than anyone else. Malin's biggest disadvantage was her lack of stamina and slowness, which made it difficult for her to properly dodge the Cyclops attacks. So for the rest of the time, she focused more on endurance training than on dark flare. And then in the evening after practicing hard, she would sit down to study. And all night long, she never once got up from her chair. Simon was very surprised to hear that then, because he always thought Malin was just a genius, but she was actually a very hard worker. According to Cammy, Malin didn't even sleep properly so that she could study. They would study together until late at night in the sorority lounge, and when she came back from her nap the next morning, she still saw Malin. She said she overcame her fatigue and sleepiness with medication and potions so that it wouldn't interfere with her while she was studying. From morning until bedtime she had to study, and whenever Simon saw her she was studying, and it was truly commendable. But he had no idea what made her so persistent. As soon as the run was over the students laid down on the grass as if it was just what they had been waiting for. The teacher's aides were walking around as usual, handing out stamina-restoring drinks. Malin approached them with a quick step, and smiling asked Simon to look at her. She said she was about to show a leap of darkness, bent her knees, and jumped up on the spot. It was quite high, and a black jet formed under her feet. Sliding on the grass, she came down and looked at Simon and friends who were amazed at her skill. Malin asked them how they were doing and if she needed to tweak anything. Simon replied to her that she was really good and she did great. She was very happy to hear that because she hadn't wasted so much time practicing. Simon replied to her that she was really amazing. To overcome weakness in such a short time. As Cammy said, it was an amazing accomplishment. Of course, backstage, she had to put in an unthinkable amount of effort. And still she looked like she was abusing her legs. When she landed, their condition didn't look the best. Simon advised her not to exert herself too much, worrying about her health. He reasoned that they were able to defeat the Cyclops during the simulation, so they would also be able to handle the real one and get a good grade. But Malin had a fire in her eyes, and she was not going to be satisfied with just a score and a good grade. She wanted to be the best among all the teams. She said her goal was first place and she would try her best to get it. As Simon was about to open his mouth to say something, the teacher's aides clapped their hands and told everyone to get up and start running towards the next goal. Simon stared at Malin for a moment, trying to guess what was motivating her. But then he stood up and walked towards the others. The students who were already accustomed to Hong Peng's classes quickly stood up and lined up. At the professor's command, everyone ran down the slope, enjoying the cool breeze and the incredible view around them. After all, in this place where yellow flowers were blooming, it looked as if the entire mountain was covered in gold. Simon couldn't help but marvel at how Hong Peng only chose to study in places with beautiful natural scenery. When they reached the next point on the trail, Simon stopped to catch his breath, but Hong Peng immediately approached him. She asked him if he was practicing the jet black operation that she had taught him properly. He responded by assuring her that of course he was practicing. Hong Peng had taught Simon the technique of temporarily increasing the body's capability by activating the jet black in the body. The professor was delighted with how fast Simon was learning and kept telling him that magical combat would suit him better than any other subject. But their sweet conversation was interrupted by one of the assistants, who ran to the professor with some urgent news. It turned out that one of the students had hurt herself and sprained the ligaments in her ankle. Hong Peng ran after the assistant, but lastly told Simon to remember that only practice would help improve his skills. Simon walked over to his friends who along with all the students sat on the grass and drank the refreshments. He immediately asked Cammy where Malin was and she immediately said she didn't know. Cammy justified that she was behind all the time, as well as Dick, and they were looking for her together after they reached the right point. And they hoped that Simon had seen her. But unfortunately for them, he didn't know where she was either. Professor Hong Peng asked her assistant what happened. He carried the girl on his shoulders and told her that the injury looked serious. The students, seeing all this, began to whisper among themselves. Indescribable horror seized our friends when they saw who it was. It was Malin and the bandage was wrapped around her ankle. After this incident she was taken to the medical center and there, after a detailed examination and bandaging, the doctor came to her and told her that her ankle ligaments were very badly stretched. And now for the time being, make use of crutches, and going to classes is fine, but make sure to skip all classes with physical activities for about a week. Her friends were shocked at this news and didn't know what to say. Malin jumped up from the bed trying to convince the doctor that she could walk and that she was fine because nothing serious had happened. The next moment, however, she nearly fell over from the pain and Cammy had to hold her up. The doctor was relentless and addressed her in a confident voice, saying that this is an order, not a recommendation. Malin was confused. Now she would have to skip the test. The doctor continued that he gets that she's passionate about the classes, but there are things without exceptions and for him the patient's recovery comes first. He's going to exclude her from all classes that require physical activities for a week. Malin clenched her fists with helplessness at this news. Cammy tried to comfort her and felt really sorry for her. Malin was very upset, but she couldn't afford to cry in front of everyone, so she asked everyone to leave her alone for a while. Everyone except Simon started to leave, going to listen to the request. Cammy noticed that he wasn't going anywhere and asked what he was waiting for. But Simon gathered his resolve and told Malin that nothing would change if she drowned in self-pity. Cammy and Dick were surprised. It was a very cold statement that was unlike the usual Simon. Malin asked in desperation what he suggested she do then, what they could do about the upcoming fight with Cyclops. Simon answered her that they would surely find a way out. She laughed. It was a very self-mocking and hysterical laugh. Then she said, "You know it too, right? This is the tactic that we worked hard and planned on for a week. We practiced desperately only in this position, and tomorrow is the actual battle against the living Cyclops. What the hell do you mean by a way out?" Dick and Cammy didn't know what to say to her. Then she asked if he was laughing at her, and even if he was, let him laugh all he wanted because it was her fault. And all of them will get the lowest grades for practice because of her, and then they will be kicked out of Kizen and all because of her. After all, she hurt herself because she was trying too hard. But Simon confidently stopped her, telling her that enough was enough. He had an idea how to solve everything. Dick and Cammy looked at him in surprise and he told everyone that if it was okay with everyone, then tomorrow he would be the attacker instead of Malin. Simon's eyes gleamed. The three of them suddenly felt goosebumps rising up their backs. Was that really Simon? It almost felt like he was a different person. The next day, all the first-year students walked down a corridor of dark and ancient dungeons lit by dim lamps. The students wondered how such a small island could have so many dungeons and ruins. Kizen's underground dungeons were some sort of supersized prison that kept the monsters from the continent captured. Not only monsters, but all kinds of terrible criminals in the continent were also said to be imprisoned at the bottom of the dungeon. Dick assumed that what they had seen was only a small part of Nephthys' collection, who after her travels across the continent had brought interesting locations to the island. Cammy was very surprised. She turned to Dick and asked if it was really Nephthys' work. She found it hard to believe, but Dick was sure it was. Meanwhile, Simon and Malin leaning on a crutch walked side by side in silence and a dark atmosphere. There was an understandable reason for this, and around them they could hear the students whispering to each other about their team's bad luck. Some felt sorry for them, but most were just glad to be rid of the competition. Malin found it especially painful and hard to bear the whispers behind her back, because they were saying that if the attacking member is in that state, they can't do anything about it. It's all screwed up from the start till the end. Cammy hesitantly asked if they were going to be okay and Dick was sure they were, and he was going to show what he could do. And asked her to trust Simon because he knew exactly what to do. His confidence to Simon, who couldn't figure out what he might have missed in his new plan. When they arrived at the venue, they had to wait their turn until one of the assistants called their team forward. When they stepped forward into the arena, the other students didn't understand what was going on. Why were they still participating with the injured contestant? Hadn't the doctor forbidden her? But then they saw that Simon would be in front, which created a new wave of whispers and talk among the students. Someone said that they wanted to show that they were trying their best until the very end to get extra, or even if they couldn't defeat the Cyclops. Watching everything from the back rows was Hector. From the look on his face, it was absolutely clear that he did not wish the number 7 team any good. Before the test began, Simon addressed his team and assured them that everything would be fine. Even though the situation was a little different, it didn't mean that they had tried in vain to prepare. And he asked them to work hard until the end. To show everyone what they can do. At the command of one of the assistants, a Cyclops was released into the arena, who was staring at them furiously with his unseeing red eyes and breathing heavily. He was chained and under a restraining curse. Its size was gigantic, it seemed to be bigger than in the simulation, and there was something else that was different from the simulation. It was the smell. The Cyclops stank incredibly badly so that tears came to my eyes. Suddenly the shackles fell off the Cyclops with a clatter. And there was the voice of Professor Jane, who warned them that now their test would begin, but they did not need to force themselves too much. And if they felt that they couldn't handle it, they were to immediately ask for the trial to stop. After the last warnings, a curse was lifted from the Cyclops, which dissipated with a small explosion. The very next moment, the professor's words were heard that the trial had begun. And the Cyclops ran to attack without delay with a shout. Simon's skeletons ran forward to distract the Cyclops, while Simon told his friends to do everything like in training, because only their formation had changed, but the plan remained the same. First they had to distract the monster's attention. But as it turned out, Cyclops just ignored the skeletons and continued to run straight at Simon, crushing one of the skeletons on the way. And ignoring the other skeletons, he tried to attack Simon with his club. Simon barely had time to bounce aside, and the Cyclops' powerful blow hit the void. Something was wrong with his behavior. Dick became indignant. What was up with that? During the simulation, the Cyclops was primarily aiming for the skeletons. Malin tried to explain it away by saying that reality and simulation were different and he was just hitting everything he saw. But what was happening in the arena was not like that at all. Cyclops was purposefully pursuing Simon. And as soon as he dodged one blow, the next one followed. Each blow was so powerful that it scattered the rocks it hit. Simon managed to recover one of his skeletons and tried to use it to attack the Cyclops from the back. But to his surprise, the sword not only did not do any damage, but broke against the Cyclops' skin. Dodging another blow, Simon thought that this was much harder than the simulation. As the Cyclops stalked Simon, he walked into the area of application of the curse of attrition. Immediately, Cammy and Dick used their curses at the same time. The Cyclops stopped for a moment and cried out in pain. This moment was used by Simon. He jumped high above the Cyclops, and his skeleton threw him a spear. which Simon caught in flight. He half-turned and threw it at the Cyclops' head. But his throw did not hit the target, only scratched the Cyclops' cheek, who now looked at him in surprise. Simon landed some ground and pound. This time he was so close but he lacked accuracy. The Cyclops came to his senses and continued his furious hunt for Simon. Dodging time after time, Simon thought that if he hadn't learned to control the darkness he would have been out long ago. Right now, he was only holding on thanks to Hong Peng's lessons. But it couldn't go on like this for long, and at one moment, the Cyclops brought his club right above him. It struck with force, aiming straight at him. Everyone was notified that Simon's shield level had decreased to 72%. And that was from a simple scratch. Because Simon had managed to dodge, it was too much. Simon held on to his bruised arm and tried to regain consciousness. Meanwhile, in the observation room, one of the assistants came up to Professor Jane and said that there seemed to be something wrong with the Cyclops, because it was much stronger than the other teams. Even strong curses didn't work on it. He recommended that she stop the test immediately and replace the Cyclops with another one. However, the professor didn't think so and suggested he'd better observe for now. The assistant started to protest that it wasn't fair, but she paid absolutely no attention to him and continued to watch the screens. Then she added that honesty is not an important quality in Kizen. She continued to grade them as if nothing had happened. Then questioned her assistant, do they only choose weak opponents for real combat? Do warriors surrender immediately after it turns out that their opponent exceeds their expectations or when unforeseen circumstances come up? The assistant could not find anything to answer her. But then he did answer her that this was not a real battle, but a simulation, and these students were too young and inexperienced for real battles. The professor still stood her ground. She thought that age didn't matter. What was important wasn't the numerical values such as tests or scores, but what a student could learn from a particular experience. In other words, what was important was that they were from Kizen and should be able to get out of any situation and learn from it. So she advised the assistant to trust them and just see what they can do. And added that from the looks of it, they had already guessed what they needed to change in their strategy. Meanwhile, Simon was hiding behind one of the ruined pillars, trying to catch his breath. Simon realized exactly what was wrong, and after a little breathing he was going to act in a new way. Dick meanwhile couldn't understand why there was absolutely no effect from the 3 simultaneous curses of exhaustion. He looked at this Cyclops and didn't realize how many more times they would need to use attrition to stop him and what would be left of Simon in that time. Simon advised them to give up trying to use the attrition curses since they didn't seem to have any effect on the monster. Malin was indignant that this couldn't be the case, since they had all seen how all the other teams had succeeded in using attrition. Simon replied that he didn't know why that was. Maybe they were just unlucky in that they had gotten a Cyclops in good shape. But they needed to change their strategy and attack differently. But the question remained, how? The attacking member, the drawing of attention with the undead, and even the cursing didn't work. Everything they had planned was in vain. What more were they supposed to do here? Simon rose from his hiding place and said whatever they had to do, just do what they want and can do. His movement caught the Cyclops' red eye and it began to turn toward him. Simon, standing right in front of the giant, advised them to forget about the tactics they were developing, and ran towards the Cyclops, telling them to help him as much as they wanted. He ran as fast as he could and dodged the Cyclops' club. Hearing his reply, Cammy immediately attacked the Cyclops with a spell of blood silk, which immediately blocked the enemy's vision. She smiled happily and said that she could help Simon as much as she wanted. At the same time, Dick tossed Simon 2 blades with blades covered in darkness, telling him he could use them. The skeletons jumped high into the air and caught the darkness-enhanced swords, then rushed at the unsuspecting Cyclops, intending to strike him from the back. In the next moment, the skeletons armed with blades struck at the Cyclops' unprotected back. The Cyclops roared painfully, then tried to remove the bloody silk from his head. At the same time, Simon told himself to focus. There were still too many different thoughts in his head. The fierce battle continued. Perhaps it was madness, but he closed his eyes. The noise on the field instantly subsided. His consciousness expanded and his spirit strengthened. The sound disappeared and time slowed down. This was the world Bahil had shown him in his curses class. With a single experience, Simon was able to partially replicate that image. Thanking Professor Bahil to himself, Simon opened his eyes. A large number of armed skeletons burst out of subspace onto the ground. Following Simon's orders, they immediately attacked the Cyclops, who had already freed himself from the red silk and raised his cudgel in the air with a menacing roar. But the skeletons did not care about the size or strength of the enemy, because they obeyed the will of their summoner. Simon split them up and sent 3 skeletons at a time to the Cyclops with a cross-action. Some furiously attacked the leg, while others tried to do damage to the giant's back. A few more warlike skeletons at the same time threw several spears at once at the Cyclops, which were reinforced by a spell. The Cyclops covered himself with his arm, but the pain even from a hit to his arm was very strong. Yes, so much so that the next moment he opened his eyes wide in pain and let out a very loud painful roar. The students watching from the waiting room, seeing a strategy that was not in the introduction, began to wonder if team number 7 had come up with a new plan. Someone answered that since they had changed the formation, the plan must have changed as well. Hector, who was sitting behind the others, smirked as he watched the fight. At the same time, Simon, breathing heavily and with abrasions on his body, was thinking to himself that he was still missing something. It was as if he felt he could do better. Suddenly he remembered the words of Pier, who had told him that in order to move the undead one must have a strong will. And so all high-level necromancers should be able to act in all situations. And also with the same fervor they should use emotions like anger, hatred, because the more negative the emotion was, the stronger the effect was. Hate, anger, a determination stronger than anything in the world, these were the emotions that overwhelmed him at that moment. Simon opened his eyes wide. Kill him, were his only thoughts that filled his every thought. The recovery speed of the damaged skeletons became faster. At this moment, under Simon's absolute order, the Legion existed to destroy Cyclops. The students who were watching all of this were amazed at what was happening, as they had never seen the undead summoned by a necromancer be so strong and bloodthirsty before. A relentless assault. A strike route with no pattern. A mixture of the irregular and the regular. It was a scene that truly showed the essence of the necromancer. The Cyclops, who could no longer bear this pain, roared furiously, throwing the skeletons away from him. Then exploded in rage with countless wounds all over his body, pierced the skeletons and rushed at Simon. Seeing this, Cammy screamed in horror for him to dodge, however it was too late. Simon was now in a state of total immersion beyond concentration. His reaction was delayed. No sooner had Simon prepared himself than the Cyclops club came crashing down on his head. Black elemental magic, dark ice, wall of ice, spoke a cold and confident voice that belonged to the Meen standing behind him. Hearing those words, Simon turned around with incomprehension. A bright blue light began to shine in front of him. The next moment, a huge wall of ice appeared in front of him and blocked the monster's attack. Turning to the incomprehensible and confused Simon, Meen shouted in a firm voice to him not to stop, as he would succeed. The ice wall continued to rise, preventing the Cyclops from moving. He tried to break free from the wall, and the blood from his wounds soaked the blue glacier. Simon, who was able to catch his breath thanks to this, looked at the Cyclops breaking through the ice wall, saying that all the conditions had finally been met, then shouted to Cammy to start. When she heard the boy's words, the girl said she understood. She used a spell that only vampires could use, which made her eyes bleed. And in the next moment, black flames erupted all over the body of Camabears, who was standing in the established pose. Her hair swept upward, and red, tear-like streams of blood flowed from her eyes. A flower amongst flowers in blood magic. Specifically the spell Bleed Overflow. Forearms, chest, shoulders, thighs, and heels. Fountains of blood gushed from the countless wounds that Simon's skeletons had inflicted so far. The bleed and poison spells were the most powerful means of support a team member in a given position could provide. The scene where blood flowed from wounds all over the huge monster's body was both terrifying and amazing. In an instant, the entire dungeon was colored red. Cammy, who had used up too much energy, began to fall to the ground, staggering from anemia, but she was caught by Dick, who had arrived in time to stop her from falling. That was the end of her work. Breathing heavily, she shouted to Simon that everything was now in his hands. Hearing the girl's words, Simon shouted for them not to worry and leave it to him. This time he put his hands in the air. This was a skill he had practiced over and over again until now. In fact, it was a secret skill that out of all the Kizen freshmen, only he knew. The skeleton bones scattered on the ground of the dungeon flew into the air. Simon clenched his fist. After which, he applied the skill, Simon Valencia Original, Bone Nail. As a result of which, the many bones floating in the air flew forward and pierced into the Cyclops' wounds opened by Camabear's bleeding magic. A secret technique that allowed over 100 wounds to be attacked at once. The Cyclops went into a frenzy of pain. He screamed, toppled over onto his back, and began mindlessly banging his head against the wall. Simon clenched his fist and twisted his right arm to the side. The bones penetrated the wounds and began to gather toward the center to execute the restore order. They severed blood vessels, tore organs and penetrated through muscles. The development also caused a storm of emotion among those watching, who exclaimed in admiration at how cool it was. No one could have imagined such a stunning scene from Group 7. There was something about Simon and Group 7's performance that warmed their hearts as necromancers to the point where they completely forgot that they were competing against each other. However, on the battlefield, things were not as rosy as they might seem. Simon's right arm had gone stiff. It was impossible to order further recovery as he had used up all the jet black remaining on his bones. Realizing this, he shouted to the guys to throw potions. After listening to Simon, Dick and Malin took out the nervy potions and threw them at the wounded Cyclops. After the hit, the Cyclops' muscles could be seen twisting and contracting as the liquid from the potion entered the wound, which was a sign that everything was working. However, that alone was not enough. Looking at the badly wounded but still alive Cyclops, Simon with hope in his eyes asked himself not to get up. However, contrary to all expectations, the miracle did not happen. And Cyclops, covered in blood, and also emitting a fierce roar, began to rise to his feet. No one could not believe what was happening, because usually after such wounds he should have already died. Breathing heavily and with an angry look, Simon looked at the Cyclops, who despite the fact that the bones of his body were twisted, blood sucked out, and organs smashed, he was approaching him like a living corpse. Realizing that anything short of instant death would be useless, he shouted to Dick to prepare reinforcements. Dick immediately threw him an enchanted claymore. The body of the sword was painted jet black. Then he added that he'd put all his jet black in it. It had a lifespan of only 10 minutes. After catching the sword, Simon replied that it should be enough as they would direct all the darkness at the monster. Simon grabbed the hilt of the claymore and adopted a fighting stance. He could no longer use the activation technique he had learned from Hongpeng. In such a situation, both the monster and Simon had run out of strength. From now on, it was a battle of wills. Simon too rushed forward with determination and grit, holding the enchanted claymore in his hands. The Cyclops reached out in fury to grab Simon, but his movements were incomparably slower and sluggish than at first. And just as Simon was about to catch his slack, something happened. Suddenly his body froze in place, and the world around him turned an unfamiliar color. His vision flickered. Because he was pushing the Cyclops, he didn't even realize that his strength, both physical and mental, was at its limit. His right leg jerked and slipped, causing Simon's body to roll on the ground. Kneeling on his knees, he tried to comprehend what had happened. At the same time in the waiting room, Cindy and Jamie were excitedly shouting for him to get up and cheering him on, saying that he could beat him. At that moment, even Hector, who had been sitting on the chair all this time, got up from his seat and stared shocked at the battlefield. However, he wasn't the only one who stood up from his seat. In the observation room, not paying attention to the fallen notebook and pen, Professor Jane got up from her chair. Seeing her stare as she watched the unfolding events, the assistant was shocked, as she had been his boss for 5 years, but this was the first time he had seen her behave like this. At the same time, Simon, who was kneeling and unable to move, was staring at the huge club that was approaching him at breakneck speed. The next moment, however, a blue magic circle lit up beneath him. It was followed by Malin's voice, shouting at him to jump. Clenching his teeth, Simon rose to his feet with firm confidence and prepared to jump. The very next moment, he pushed off the ice that had thrown him, and Simon found himself high in the air. He dodged the Cyclops attack, which immediately hit him where he had just been. However, Simon's problems didn't end there. As he began to fall right onto the Cyclops' back. This could have been a great chance to deal with the monster, but not in Simon's case, because in the next moment his eyes reflected a huge club, which flew straight at him. In the next moment Cyclops struck a strong blow, which launched Simon like a rocket into the nearest wall, which he crashed into, creating a loud explosion. The screen in the waiting room showed that the resident had only 7% defense left. As Simon leaned away from the wall he had crashed into, he began to fall forward under the shouts of his comrades for him to hold on. Eventually, however, he managed to stay on his feet. Standing in a pompous pose with his head down, he began to raise his right arm. Then clenching it fiercely into a fist, he told himself with determination in his eyes that ending things like this was unworthy of a necromancer. Continuing to hold his hand in front of him, he began to pick up the scattered and broken bones. Gathering them together, the bone hands that held the sword. The next moment, the hands raised the sword intending to strike. The next second a red line was drawn across the Cyclops' neck, his eyes widened in pain. Immediately after this attack, the exhausted Simon immediately fell to the ground, leaving the Cyclops standing alone. However, the Cyclops didn't stay on his feet for long, as his head was cut off by the guy's attack and rolled on the ground in the next moment. Just then, a report was heard that Group 7 had defeated Cyclops. Hearing this, Simon kneeled down and shouted with joy that they had succeeded. He couldn't rejoice alone, however, as he was immediately embraced by Dick with tears in his eyes. "Simon. Yes. You did it, great job. I'm so proud of you, buddy. You're the best," continued to shout as Dick grabbed Simon. Malin and Cammy, who had come over, were also very happy and touched by their victory. Cammy wiped her tears and turned to Simon and said that she was very happy that he had managed to pull it off. Malin had a face containing a lot of emotions passing through her head. After wiping her face once with her hand, she returned to her usual arrogant expression and raised an open hand. "Well done. I guess I owe you for this one." As she finished saying that, her voice began trembling. To which he immediately replied that she'd done well too. Simon's words caught her off guard. Excitedly and a little nervously, Malin began to mumble something, apologizing to him for yesterday. Without having the time to hear her voice, Dick and Cammy embraced them both from each side. Once again, everyone burst into cheers and rejoiced. "Let me be serious for once, you idiots." Simon laughed harder than ever as he watched the situation. After all the performance evaluations for the morning and afternoon teams were finished, everyone in Class A gathered in the beginner dark magic lecture room. Adding that regardless of the results and scores, she was satisfied as the professor in charge that all members of Class A carried out an actual battle without any accidents. To which the students enthusiastically thanked her for her praise. However, taking the clipboard in her hand, she also added that it was the results that mattered. Jane naturally poured cold water after creating a warm atmosphere. She decided to start the evaluation with the first group and asked them to come forward. Simon sat down on his seat and listened to the other group's evaluations. As expected from Jane, she analyzed the strengths and weaknesses of each group and made suggestions for improvements that'd almost give you goosebumps. Her comments were logical and analytical, to the point where people who knew nothing about that certain group were nodding their heads without even realizing it. Suddenly turning to the two girls who were standing next to her, Professor Jane told them to shake hands. Not understanding what was happening, they stared at her, not knowing what to do. Seeing their bewilderment, she explained that they didn't ruin the teamwork like an amateur, but it'd be better to blow off the steam right away if they had problems with each other. Jane was also able to see through the relationships and mentality of students. It wasn't enough to say that her skills were out of the world. Other than that, if there was one thing that Simon thought was unexpected, there were more groups who hunted the Cyclops than he thought. Seeing Simon's surprise, Malin explained that in the first simulation, the proportion of successful groups was slightly over 40%, but in actual battle, 13 out of the 16 groups succeeded in hunting the Cyclops. Even considering the difference in practice time, they were exceedingly strong in actual fights. It was a time when they could feel the potential of Kizen students once again. And in this case, the scores they received were more important than whether or not the Cyclops was hunted. Then turning to the next group, which was Hector's group, Professor Jane graded them an A, adding that they had done well. Cheers, applause, and gazes of envy were directed at them. Hector's outstanding fighting power and leadership, the clear roles, and the teamwork between each member. They were also the only ones with 3-minute hunting time. They even had stability, as the barrier gauge exceeded 90%. Upon hearing this, the students began to murmur, wondering if Hector's group was the best in the class. Finally, turning to Group 3, the professor said that she was looking forward to seeing how each of them grew. Hector, pleased with the result and the praise, nodded and thanked Professor Jane. Finally, it was time for Group 7, which was the group Professor Jane addressed, asking them to come forward. She rustled up and took the grade sheet in her hands. It became as quiet as the grave. Then looking at the guys, she informed them that they were in a mess that couldn't be called anything else but horror. Malin squeezed her eyes tightly shut, and Cammie's lips trembled. After which, the professor reported their elapsed time, 13 minutes and 58 seconds. The participants' barrier rate was also in the numbers, 7%. There were even haphazard and improvised actions that didn't match the originally planned strategies. Putting the documents aside, she looked at the group of 7 with expressionless eyes. They had nothing to say as she presented clear numerical values. All 4 were silent, and Jane opened her mouth. Having said that their grade for the task was D, groups with a grade of less than F were the ones who failed in hunting the Cyclops. It was practically the lowest grade among the groups that hunted the Cyclops. When everyone was about to solemnly go back to their places. However, they were stopped by the voice of Professor Jane, who added that this could be the result if some information was not taken into account. After which, holding up a piece of paper, at which the members of Team Number 7 stared with a confused look. She explained that after an autopsy of the corpse of the Cyclops that Group 7 hunted, found traces that the curse and drugs used at the time of capture caused unusual side effects. What was the only thing she could tell the students was that the Cyclops exhibited extreme aggression. As soon as the curse was lifted, it became enraged and its physical abilities were temporarily strengthened. It's the upper class's judgment that the test's difficulty was significantly different from that of the Cyclopes hunted by other groups. You could hear the students whispering throughout the lecture room. Jane waved the report bearing the seal of Kizen headquarters to the student and saying that as a result of comprehensively judging the Cyclops' aggression, physical strength, and curse resistance, they'll apply the new scoring rubrics on the premise that Group 7 hunted an upper-rank Cyclops, one with the level of a red Cyclops. Hearing this, there was a look of shock on the faces of all the team members. Professor Jane continued, saying that they should therefore make an honest assessment of the group. Hector's facial expression became harsher. If it was the decision of the top Kizen class, the students couldn't argue with it. Of course, it was also true that all the A-class students had the same question about Cyclops as Simon. After which she began to announce the grades, starting with Malin. Hearing her name, the girl excitedly stepped forward. Turning to the girl, Professor Jane said that she had played a key role in defending a participating member with coal-black elemental magic that far exceeded the average of first-year Kizen students. That's what she was given 80 points for. Malin couldn't answer immediately, and her shoulders trembled slightly while tears appeared in her happy eyes. Then turning to Dick, she informed him that he had applied highly effective black charms at the right time and place to play the role of Group 7's lubricant in the hunt for Cyclops. Similarly, he was given a score of 80. Again there was an explosion of applause. Dick thanked the professor with a happy face. Next, turning to Ursula Camemberts, Professor Jane said that even as a novice student of hemomancy, she had done well as the main attacker of Group 7. Even among necromancers working in the field, it was hard to see such a level of excessive bleeding magic. Because of which she was given a score of 85. Camembert's eyes filled with tears from the emotions that came in a wave. Finally, Simon Valencia. After these words that Professor Jane said, there was instant silence in the lecture hall. Then turning to Simon, he informed that he had contributed as a member. Was also able to take care of the team members despite the unexpected change, and found time on his own to escape the Cyclops attacks. Also fulfilled the prerequisite for bloodletting by damaging the monster's body with a dramatic summoning operation, and his use of the recovery skill was impressive. In the end, he finished off Cyclops as well. After reading the protocol, she slightly exhaled and opened her mouth. Then saying that his performance was perfect, for which he is given 100 points for his personal score. When he heard that, he stared at the professor dumbfounded, unable to believe what he was hearing. She added with a slight smile on her face that it was a pity that there was no grade higher than A+. With those words, Jane hinted that the best A grade was Group 7, and that drove a wedge. Shouts of surprise and admiration immediately echoed around the hall. Hector closed his eyes and leaned back deeply in his seat. One of his friends wanted to address him, but he ordered him to shut up in a cold voice. He added that if he didn't, he'd rip his tongue out. Looking angrily at Simon, he could not accept another defeat. Team Number 7, in a warm atmosphere, rejoiced at their victory, which was their first step towards becoming the strongest necromancers on the continent.